it was soul destroying. He'd put me down as a neurotic mother and that we were difficult parents. And he just said there was nothing wrong with her. As a parent, you know when there's something that's not quite right. Go with that gut instinct because I think you're seldom wrong with anything like that.
Hello and welcome to another podcast recording with a very special guest that I have on today. She's a lovely lady from our village here in southwest Scotland, Jill Thompson, and she's here to talk about a very sensitive subject in relation to her daughter, Carly, who unfortunately is no longer with us, but she wants to talk about the sort of life that she had with Carly and the health issues that Carly had and obviously the struggles that Jill had trying to get diagnosis and recognition of Carly's condition and help and support for them as a family unit. I'm going to, as I do with all guests, I'm going to let Jill introduce herself in full about who she is and background to obviously her story, and then we'll move on to some questions. So it's over to you, Jill. Thank you.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm Jill. I've lived up here for 4 years now, and we just decided it was time for a complete life change. I haven't worked now for 14 years. My last job was a rehabilitation officer for visual impairment, and you'll probably see why that's relevant as we go through the history of me and my daughter Carly. It's lovely up here, apart from the weather today. But yes, it was the best thing that we ever did was moving up here.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Jill. I'm going to, as I do, interrogate you basically for an hour or so, and just really to help our mission at the podcast to educate and therefore empower and create autonomy for people, because you've experienced something that not a lot of people in the world will have experienced with your daughter Carly, and the struggles particularly that I know we've talked about off camera before, obviously this podcast recording. So you said you knew from 6 months that something wasn't quite right with Carly. What was it
Yes.
that you felt or saw that others couldn't or didn't see?
Well, I had a friend who had a baby at the same time as me, and obviously we used to spend quite a bit of time together, and I realised that Harry was able to do things that Carly wasn't. So, for instance, when they sat on the floor, Harry could put his palms flat on the floor, and Carly's fingertips just reached the floor, so she couldn't do that. And Jill demonstrates she couldn't do that above her head either because her arms were a bit too short. She did a lot of projectile vomiting, which they just put down to my poor parenting skills, I think. And yeah, for 6 months we realised things weren't quite right, but it was a long, hard struggle to get everybody in the medical profession to agree with that and start proceedings to investigate it, basically.
So just so for obviously anybody who's listening that might have a newborn or a toddler at least, and they're struggling because they can't understand, is that something with the palms and the reach of the arms and the vomiting, as you point to those sort of main three key features to look out for, to maybe then approach and bring up the subject of what your daughter eventually got diagnosed is, or is there multiple?
I think the arm length was obviously quite relevant because she was eventually
Right.
diagnosed with this very rare form of dwarfism. But with the projectile vomiting, I think most babies will do that at some point, but this was just constant, and it went on for months. And of course they're recording her weight gain, and there was no weight gain. So they were just saying, oh, well, it's kind of failure to thrive and you need to stop breastfeeding. You need to put her on a bottle. So I did all of that and everything still carried on. And they just basically dismissed me until my husband came home from work one day and I was on the floor sobbing because I just said, we can't keep doing this. So he took me off to the doctors, and luckily we had a very good doctor there who said, yeah, I think we probably need to investigate this further. And he referred us to a paediatrician at the local hospital. And that was the start of the nightmare, basically. But yes, it
So that's, as a parent then, what obviously it sounds like obviously you had some major struggles. Obviously Carly's struggles were very real, obviously, because you were witnessing
yeah,
those, but as a parent, you went
yeah.
through, as a parent, when you're not just ignored, but made to feel like you're the problem,
Yeah.
what does it do to you as an individual?
it was soul destroying because this consultant that we got to see at the hospital, I know we've had this conversation off record before, but he'd put me down as a neurotic mother and that we were difficult parents, and he just said there was nothing wrong with her. So back to the drawing board, basically, and in the end, I just said to him that I wasn't going to take her back there anymore, and we were going to refer all of her healthcare through to Sheffield, which has a very good teaching hospital. And I just think that was probably, well, it was the best thing we ever did. So,
So
yes, very dismissive. He was very dismissive. So we had more months of not knowing what was going on.
And that's obviously that's indicative of the times. Obviously, in those days, there was the old "Well, I'm a doctor and I know best. You're not a
Yes.
doctor,"
Yeah.
etc. Just as a sidetrack to that, if the situation that you went through with Carly happened today in 2026, do you
Yeah.
think you would encounter the same problems? Not with the diagnosis, because I think that would have been probably easier, but the engagement with medical professionals.
That's really hard to say. I think because all her other milestones were reached, she was a very
Mm,
intelligent child. So they didn't really see that there was anything massively, obviously different about her. And I think that
mm,
was part of the problem. And it was only when we got to Sheffield that we had the help of this brilliant geneticist that took us under his wing eventually, and he stuck with us until he got the diagnosis, which we only got a month before she died. But every time we got a different diagnosis from the different doctors and specialists that we saw, he would say every time, "I don't think that's right, but we'll keep on." And he did keep on. He was with us for about 3 years, I think, altogether. And if
right.
it wasn't for him, I think we'd have both gone insane. It was a difficult time.
So you found a good one there. At what point did you decide then, Jill, to trust your own instincts over those of the professionals around you?
I think that was when she was 6 months old, and he just dismissed me because I think as a parent, and I would
Yeah.
say as a mother, but as a parent, when there's something that's not quite right. And
Hmm.
I think anybody who's struggling with a small child or a baby and they think something isn't quite right, go with that gut instinct, because I think you're seldom wrong with anything like that. And at the end of the day, if there is no problem, that's absolutely brilliant. But if there is a problem, you're on that road, because that's quite a hard road to be on, and it takes up all of your time and effort and
Hmm.
energy. And as I've always said, life just becomes a battle otherwise, because you're fighting everybody, fighting education and the health authority. It's tough. It is tough. And I don't think that's any different. I think any child nowadays, if they have a disability of any kind, will still have that battle to fight as a family.
Yeah, I mean, in those days at the time you were going through those
Yeah.
struggles with Carly and obviously the healthcare, we're talking a couple of decades ago, aren't we? So we're
Well,
talking well
it's more
before
30 years ago now. Yeah.
changes of attitude in medicine. So for you to go against the grain must have been
Yeah.
also quite a difficult thing to think of, because there would have been in those days people, there still is in these days in modern times, people who dismiss a person like you who says, well, I'm not happy with this
Yeah.
medical advice. So that on top of obviously just trying your best for Carly must also have been something to play on your mind, was it?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't work in my old job. I couldn't go back to work because we had so many medical appointments that then came as a result of
Mm,
starting this sort of progress. And she was going to go to the local school where we lived at the time when she got to, I think she'd have been 3, something like that. And they just wrote a letter to us and said, "Dear Mrs. Thompson, I'm sorry, we won't be able to accept Carly because we already have a child with a disability in the school and we
mm,
can't cope with 2." And that was the start of the education progress, because I thought, I don't want her to go to a school that doesn't want to accept her, because if I force the issue there, I'm just putting my child in a place that isn't welcoming. And I didn't
mm,
want that. So again, I went to Sheffield, and it was down to education funding at which school they sent her to. So we looked at 3, and I just said I wanted to go to the one in Sheffield. And they said, well, we might not be able to pay for that. And I said, well, I'll move to Sheffield then if that's what it takes. So
Mm,
you just had to constantly be battling with somebody about what you thought was the best thing for your child. And I still think that's the case today, because obviously funding these days is even worse now than
mm,
it was back then. So yeah, you spend your life fighting for what you think is
mm.
right for your child, or the best for your child. Not necessarily everybody else's opinion it's not right, but you do what's best for you and yours.
Of course, of course. And do you think, I'm assuming, because it happens in this modern times where people turn against the healthcare provider, whoever that be, a GP or a surgeon or a consultant. Is there any tips that you could give to a parent today? Just maybe one tip who's gonna, because they're gonna experience kickbacks. We all had
Yes.
it. I've had it in the past where I complained. So just as a side thing, I went to a doctor, a GP, because I was clearly depressed, severely sort of on the edge of a breakdown, and he sent me to the Citizens Advice Bureau. So obviously, it's not the greatest advice to give from a medical professional. Um,
No.
and I complained, but I was removed then from the practice list because I complained. Now, obviously, that wouldn't happen in the modern day with my experience and qualifications, but it does happen, and it still happens. So in your case, even then, way back, there would have been potential kickbacks thinking, oh, well, this is a troublemaker. Did you find the obstacles became bigger because of the fact that you sort of kicked back? And if that was the case, how did you
Mm.
overcome them? And then how could somebody in a modern day world overcome those as big as we are now with health?
I just think you have to stand your ground. I think after that initial consultant, I think we got quite lucky in that we did have mostly supportive people on board with us in every single area. But obviously, it's still the same now, where the social workers will say, well, there's no funding to pay for this and there's no funding to pay for that. So you're still battling the cost of everything. And I think that will still apply, and that will always apply. And I think that's probably harder. But if you can get your team on board, I mean, I like to think I never lost my temper with anybody. I was always reasonable, and I
Mm,
reasoned things out with the people that were involved in her care, because you're not going to get anywhere if you don't. So whilst it
true.
is really difficult, you need the support of each other at home. That
Mm,
was paramount, because I know an awful lot of people who have a child with a disability. The divorce rates and separation rates are actually
yeah.
really quite high for that, because there's so much tension involved in your relationship. So we were really lucky, because we were a team
Yeah.
and we worked as a team, and I think that helped enormously.